Hey everyone, and welcome to this game which I'm going to show you how to make 2D Breakout in JavaScript. Just JavaScript, not using any shortcuts like Canva. We're going to really cement our JavaScript logic by building out this awesome game. As always, I've kept the styling super basic. This is so you can really focus on the logic of the game, and of course so you can take it, make it your own, style it up, give it that personal flair, level it up. This game is going to be yours. So super excited about this. A fundamental knowledge of JavaScript is required but not necessary. So please have a go at coding along anyway and just see how you get on. And yeah, this is going to be the game. We're essentially going to have some blocks and then the user block at the bottom, which moves from left to right, or in other words on the x-axis, and the ball that checks for collisions either with other blocks or the walls or with the floor at the bottom, in which case it's a game over. Your goal, of course, is to hit all the blocks in order to win the game. So what are we waiting for? Let's do it. Okay, so let's do it. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new project on WebStorm, which is my IDE of choice. Of course, you can use whatever you wish. I'm just going to go ahead and call this JavaScript Breakout, okay, because that is what we're going to be creating. And I'm going to save this directory or folder in a directory or folder called WebStorm Projects that lives on my computer. So that's all I'm going to do. It's an empty project. Okay, there's no files in here, so please go ahead and do the same. And then we're of course going to add some files. So the first file we're going to add is an index.html. I'm going to go ahead and add the HTML extension for this, even though you don't really have to because we've already selected HTML as the file of choice. Now, it's important to give the .html extension and spell it correctly so that it gets this logo here, so that our code editors know to treat this as an HTML file. Okay? So this is the boilerplate code that gets given to me. Of course, if you aren't using WebStorm, please copy this before moving on. Now, I'm going to go ahead and call this Breakout, because if you save this file and then view what this looks like on the internet, so on WebStorm I could just press this, title will show up here, and we don't want that to be the case. We want to have Breakout show up instead. So we can have Breakout, you can have Breakout game, you can really have whatever you wish. Okay? And if you're not using WebStorm, you can also just copy the path, copy the absolute path, and then just paste it in the browser, just like so. Okay, so we're just getting the index.html file that lives in a folder called JavaScript Breakout, that lives in a folder called WebStorm Projects. And 2D Breakout game shows up here. I'm just going to inspect this page. Okay, so this will help us debug as we code along. So here is the elements, and here's the console log for when we start with JavaScript. Okay, so let's move on. Now, the only things we're really going to have in here, so in the body tags, is one h1 element, and it's just going to show the score. So I'm going to hard code that as 0, but if we want to change this, I'm going to pick this out, pick out the whole element by the ID of score. So the whole thing we will be able to pick out. And the other div that I'm going to do is simply add a div. Okay, and we're going to give this the class of grid, as we do want to style it. So that's why I've chosen to give this a class and not an ID. Again, it is up to you. So great, that's literally the only elements that we're going to add. Next, we're going to also link up our style sheet. So I'm going to do so up here, link rel style sheet. Thank you, tab 9, for suggesting that. And there's the href. We're just going to put the file name. So it's suggested style CSS. I'm kind of happy with that name. So I'm just going to create a new style sheet. Let's call it style. And then I'm just going to maybe styles CSS. It's up to you. I've called it styles. I know some people like to call it a style sheet. Or you keep all your styles in the CSS file. Like, it's, again, very subjective. Okay, so we've linked up our CSS file to the index.html file. Next, we also need to link up the script tag. So thanks again for the suggestion, tab 9. I'm not going to call it this. However, I'm going to call it an app.js file. So app.js, there we go. We've created an app.js file, giving the JS extension so our code editor knows to treat this as a JavaScript file. And then because it's in the same place as my index.html file, and we don't need to go any folders to find this file, I could just simply put the file name. And great, that is now all linked up. This is honestly Really, all the HTML we're going to do in this whole tutorial, which is wild. So let's actually get rid of that now and move on. So let's go ahead and maybe start by picking out the grid and styling it up in the CSS file. So, well, it is a class name, right? Because we gave the element a class name of grid, and dot essentially means we're looking for a class name of grid, and any element with a class name of grid, we're going to give a position of absolute. We're also going to hard code the width to be 500 pixels and the height should be 500 pixels too. So we've just made a square. However, maybe let's make the width a little bit larger and just change the height a little bit to be 300. So now it's a rectangle. Okay, I think that's more likely to work for this game. Let's also give it a border so we can kind of see it. I'm going to go with solid 1 pixels black. Again, I'm just doing very basic styling, so please feel free to change this when you want. And I'm just going to space it out from the top a little bit by 100 pixels. Okay, so if you save this file and refresh, there is our grid. Okay, very, very basic. Let's move on. Like I said, I really want you to, improve on the styling, which is why I'm not going too overboard. Hopefully that makes sense. So we've got our grid ready. Now let's actually get to injecting stuff and working with the DOM in JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is, well, first off, I'm just going to minimize that. Let's go ahead and pick out the grid. So I'm going to pick out the grid using document query selector and looking for an element with the class name of grid. So look for that class name by that dot. And I'm going to save it under the const grid so we can work with it easier in our file. Let's also do for the score. So I'm going to save this as score display. I'm going to look in the document again, use the query selector to look for an element with the ID of score. So hash is looking for an ID, the dot is looking for a class name. Okay, so that's all we're doing. We're picking those out and we're saving them under const so we can work with them better in our JavaScript. The other thing I'm going to define is actually a block width. So this is how big I want my little block that is moving. Let's also define the block height. So block height, and I'm just going to make this 20. Okay, so that is my block that we're going to essentially move. Let's also save the actual board width. Of course, we need to make it the same as whatever we saved as here. So width 560, height 300, const board height 300. Great. So now that we've done that, let's actually put our user somewhere. And to do this, I'm actually going to use arrays each time because we're going to want to put an x-axis and a y-axis. So I'm going to say that it's going to be 230x and 10y. So the user start is always going to be constant, right? We're always going to start from the same place. However, the current position is going to change. And obviously, when we very first start the game, the current position of the user is the user start. So let's just paste that there. But this will change, once we start playing the game. So hopefully that makes sense. This will always be the same. We're always going to start from the same position. And then the current position will start off being the user position, but will change. So we're going to have to override this, and hence I use the let. Let's do the same for the ball start using the same logic. The ball, however, I'm going to make it a little bit off. So that's what I'm going to use. So off the user start because I want it to appear above the block. And once again, let ball current position equal the ball start. So maybe let's actually add this first, right? So let's start off with adding the user. Add user and const user equals, I'm going to create an element and let's create a div. And now let's get that div. So we've created a div, we stored it under the const user, but we haven't actually done anything with it yet. We haven't added it to our document. So first off, however, I'm going to add a class list. Okay, classes add, and then tab 9 suggested we call this class user. So I'm happy with that. Let's grab the class name of user, and I'm just going to once again give it a position of absolute. The width of the user is going to be 100 pixels. The height is going to be 20 pixels, so just like the block. And I'm just going to give it a background color of blue. Okay, so save that. So we've added the class to the div. So we've styled it to look kind of like a block. And now we need to grab the grid. So the grid that we picked out here, and we're going to use a method called append child to put in the user. Now I'm going to also draw it. Okay, so at the moment, if we save this and refresh, there's the block. However, we want to use the current position of our user to position it on the grid, right? So in order to do this, I'm going to get the user, I'm going to get its style left, and I'm going to use current position, go into the first item because we're working on the x-axis, and just append the pixels to it. Okay, so if we save that, ta-da, we've moved left here. If you focus on this, we've added a left property of 230 pixels from the edge of the grid, okay, as that is the parent element. So if I get rid of that, it's there. I've just added it like so. I've appended px to it because otherwise it would say 230 and it would not work. Cool, let's do the same from the bottom. So user style bottom, I've chosen to do it from the bottom and not the top. And we're going to go into the current position, which is technically user start, and get the second item from the array. So current position 1 plus px. And now, ta-da, from the bottom, we've gone 10 pixels. So as you can see here, ta-da, it's 10 pixels from the bottom of the parent element. Wonderful. I'm actually going to take this and put it in a function called draw user, as we will be reusing this. So draw user is my function. Let's maybe define it, function, draw user. And then I'm just going to put that in there. So now we can essentially reuse this function wherever we want. And I want to call it once right after we add the user. Okay, cool. Now let's do the same for drawing the ball. So hopefully you know how to do this really, because it's literally the same logic. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and do it here. Add ball, that is correct. So once again, const ball. And we are going to use document, create element, and we're going to create a div. And then we're going to get that ball. We're going to add the class list, add ball. So let's go ahead and create that class list here, perhaps, dot ball. And then I'm just going to add a position absolute again. The width of this is going to be 20 pixels. Thanks for adjusting that tab 9, but it's not right. So height or width, let's maybe make it red is fine. And I'm just going to add a border radius of 10 pixels. So half the width and height. So we've created that class. We've added it here. Now let's grab the grid. That's right. Append the child ball. And then, of course, we need to write a function. So once again, function draw ball, and I think we can commit that. Essentially, tab 9 has learned from our code, and this looks good to me. Again, we're going to use draw ball, and then we're going to get the ball style left. That's right, tab 9. I'm happy to commit this. It's learned from our code, and it knows we want to get the ball current position, go into the array and get the first item, because obviously ball start is now ball current position, and then add px and do the same for the second element, which we use as the y-axis. So now that we have written that function, I could just call it. And now if we look in here, ta-da, the ball is added. Wonderful. Let's move on. The next thing I'm going to use is a constructor in order to create my multiple blocks. So right under here, let's go ahead and do this, my block. I'm going to use the class of block, just like so, and create a constructor. I'm going to use x-axis, let's call this y-axis, this, and then I'm just going to get rid of that so we can start fresh. So we're going to pass through two things, okay, like we've been doing here, an x-axis and a y-axis. So this time, what I need to do is actually know where my bottom left corner of the block is. So for example, here's my block. I want to know what this is. I want to know what this is. I want to know the coordinates of this, and I want to know the coordinates of this, because we're going to have to figure out if our ball goes anywhere in this area. Okay, so that's why I'm doing this. So let's go ahead and define our bottom left corner. And this is just going to be literally the x-axis that we pass through and the y-axis. So that's our starting point, essentially, the bottom left. Now let's define the bottom right. Okay, and let's have a look at this. If this is our starting point and this is x and y, right, this point will essentially be the x-axis plus the block width, which we saved as a const, and then the y-axis will stay the same. So let's go ahead and do that. X-axis plus block width, and then pass through the y-axis, and the block width is defined here. So we just defined the bottom left. Let's also define the top right. And again, the top right, so this is the top right. We're getting the x-axis and adding the block width, but we're also getting the y-axis and adding the block height. So let's go ahead and do that. And thank you, tab 9. I think, yes, this is right. And once again, this top left. The top left is indeed the x-axis, that doesn't change, and the y-axis plus just the block height, because this is it, this is the origin point. So x-axis stay the same, but y-axis, we need to add 10 to it, which happens to be the block height, because we save that as a const. Cool. So now that we've done that, I can actually use this class to add loads and loads of blocks. So all my blocks. And I'm going to put them actually in an array. So there we go. I'm going to have new blocks. I'm going to use the constructor. And what I'm going to pass through is 10 and 270. I have actually worked all these out, so you can just go ahead and copy me. It took a really, really, really long time. New block. And then this one is going to be, let's see if tab 9 guesses these. Obviously, I've worked them out already. Let's see how smart it is. New block. Oh, wow. It has. So this is great. It has actually worked them out. These two aren't correct. So let's go again. New block, 10 to 40. New block, let's see, 120 to 40, 230 to 40, 340 to 40. New block, 450 to 40. And new block, 10 to 10. This is really incredible. I'm really impressed with tab 9 right now. We just have left 120 to 10. We'll know if we missed something because it'll be very obvious when we actually draw these out. Okay, 230 to 10, 340 and 450. So this is looking good. We've got all of them. Okay, so now let's draw all the blocks, right? Let's write a function. Move this up maybe. Let's make some space. Draw my blocks. Okay, so I'm going to write a function add blocks for, great. Okay, we are going to look at the block's length. So essentially however many are in here, but I'm going to loop over each one. So for each one, I'm going to create a div. So document create element, I'm going to make a div. And let's save this as a block so we can work with it in our JavaScript. And then I'm going to get that block and I'm going to class list add the block styling. So let's go back here. I'm just going to do block and a block. Well, position, again, absolute. Width, 100, height, 20, and the color of this. Let's keep it blue. Let's make this user blue-violet, just to differentiate it out. Okay, so now I'm going to call this down here. So we've created a div. We've added the class name of block. Of course, we're going to get the grid, and for each time it loops, we're going to add another block and another block and another block. So this is looking good. However, at the moment, if we look in here, they're all going to be in one space essentially, right? So, oh, there's so many, but they're all here. And maybe let's change this to blue. So before that, I actually need to get each block. So before we append it, we're going to get the style left. We're going to go into the blocks array, get the first item. So we're looping over each item. And we're going to get the bottom left corner, okay, as our origin. I'm going to get the x-axis from it. So we're going to go into that array and get the first item. And then I'm just going to do the same for the second item in the bottom left array. And of course, add it to the bottom. So now, ta-da, we've got all the blocks. This is looking good. Again, if you are not sure what is going on here, I'm just going to console log the blocks array out perhaps, just so you can see what is going on. So we have 15 blocks. This is the first item, okay? It's an array, and then each item has 4 properties, the bottom left, which is an array of 2 things, bottom right, and so on. So we're looping over these 15 items. We're going into the first item on the first loop and getting the bottom left, this item, as well as the bottom left, this item. And then we loop again and we do the same for this. We're getting bottom left, this item, and then this item, and so on, until we positioned all these blocks. Cool. This is looking so good. I'm just going to get rid of that. So we've drawn all the blocks now. We've added the user. We've added the ball. I think it's time to write a function to move the user. So let's go ahead and do that now. So function move user. And I'm going to use a switch case for this and pass through the E key, which means we also need to pass through the event here, because we're going to listen out for essentially any time we press on the document. So let's grab the document, add event listener, key down, and every time we press any key on our keyboard, we want to invoke the move user function. Okay, so if we press it and then we go into the switch key, we grab the event, and we can actually figure out which key was pressed on our keyboard, which is pretty cool, right? So perhaps maybe I can even console log it out for you here so you can see. So let's say that if we press the arrow left key, what do I want to happen? Well, for now, let's just get the current position, go into the array, right, and get the first item from it, because we're just going to be moving on the x-axis this time. So we want to get the x-axis, which is the first item in the array. And all I'm going to do is -10 from it. So that's all I've done. And then after I've changed the current position, so this is why this is useful, this function. So once I change the current position, I then want to redraw the whole user. So I'm just going to grab that and redraw it. Wonderful. So let's have a look. Let's press arrow left, and ta-da, it does look like it's going left. However, it goes off the grid, okay? We don't want that, so we're going to have to write a rule for if it hits this position here, okay? So of course we know that that position is 0, right? So maybe I'll console log that out too. Console log current position, and let's get that first item from it. So the X, at the moment it's 220, as you can see here. And then as soon as I go to here, you will see is if I hit here, we're at 0. So we want to stop it if current position's first item in the array gets to 0, right? So we can do that easily. I just need to say that if current position first item suddenly is larger than 0, right? So as long as it's above 0, then we can change the current position, okay? And of course, then we draw the user too. So I'm just going to move all that out into here. Great. And then we break out of this. Now let's write a case for arrow right. So this is going to be exactly the same. We're going to get the current position. We're going to get its first item. And instead of minusing 10, we're going to add 10. However, we now need to also say this only happens, so if current position 0, and as long as current position 0 is smaller than the board width, but then we also minus the actual block width. Why? I'm just going to show you now. So if we just did smaller than board width, so the board width we hard-coded here as 560 pixels. So let's do this. I'm going to, of course, have to redraw the user after we've moved the position. So let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. If it hits here, we want it to stop. However, this is our starting position, okay? This is where we start the X and Y axis. So in actual fact, it will stop here. So we don't want to stop here. We want to stop back here. So I can easily do so by getting the block width and minusing it from the board width. So minus block width. Okay, and I'm just going to wrap that in parentheses. Okay, great. And of course, we want to draw the user here too. And then we break out of this. Okay, so wonderful. Let's try it out. So now arrow right, arrow right, arrow right, and it stops there. Amazing. This is looking so good. I'm just going to get rid of this console log here as we don't really need it anymore. Let's move on. Now let's write a function to move the ball. So I'm just going to move that here. Function move ball. And I'm going to get the ball current position and get the first item from it. So just like we were doing with the user, now we're doing with the ball. We're going into the array and getting the x-axis, as that's the first item in the array. And this time, I'm just going to add 2 to it. So maybe, well, let's just do it like this. And then we also want to change the y-axis. We're going to the second item in the array. And this time, let's also add 2 to it. So you could do 1, you can do 5, you can do whatever you wish. Just depends on like how fast you want the ball to move, I guess. And after we've changed the position, we redraw the ball. Okay? So great. And the move ball, we don't control it. It's actually just going to be on an interval. So we are going to do set interval move ball, and let's move it every 30 milliseconds. You can mess around with this and these to kind of get the kind of movement that you want. And of course, let's set this to a timer ID just so that we can clear it if we need. So maybe let's do so up here. I'm going to say let timer ID and leave it blank. I'm also going to save the score up here too while we are at it. And in fact, that 2 that I saved, I'm going to save it as let direction x direction equal 2 and let y direction equal 2 as well. And we will override this, which is why I use the let. Same for these. In fact, maybe let's let the x direction be -2 for now. Why not? Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and maybe let's remove that to x direction and this to be y direction. We redraw the ball and it's on a interval. So now, ta-da, it's moving. And of course, we want to check for collisions. And if a collision happens, we want to, well, a few things to happen. So I think maybe, do we want to write this function now? Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. So check for collision. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this function. So check for collision, function check for collision, and let's do it. So first we're going to check for a block collision. So that is one thing we need to check for. And we're going to write a for loop for this. So for let I, and then we're going to go over the block's length. So however many blocks there are, we're going to check if, and we're just going to use all the positions, right? Because like I said, we're going to use the area. So we're going to use this to figure out the area of this and to figure out if the ball is anywhere in this area. So let's do it. So I'm going to get the ball current position, get the first item, and if it's smaller than the blocks, I'm going to go into the first item of the blocks array, right? Because we're looking over the first one the first time. And I'm going to get its bottom left. I'm going to get its x-axis and check if it's smaller than that. And so we're going to check for a few things. And the other thing I want to check for is if this position is smaller than, once again, the blocks I bottom right first item. And now we'll do the same for the y-axis. So we're going to go into the y-axis and we're going to actually add the ball diameter. So let's add that here, const ball diameter, right? Because we want to know how big the ball is, and we've decided that the ball is 20 pixels by 20 pixels. So now we can use the ball diameter. I'm just going to put that as open parenthesis because this, all of that, needs to be larger than the blocks I bottom left second item, so y-axis. And so these four things need to be true. We also need to get the ball current position y-axis and check that it's smaller than the blocks I, so whichever one we're looking over, top left y-axis. Okay, and if all of that is true, all four of those are true, then we can remove that block. So what I'm going to do is actually grab all the blocks again, all blocks, document query selector, all, make sure that all is there so it picks out all the elements with the class name of block, which we added here, right? So all of these should have the class name of block. So I'm going to grab all of them, and then I'm going to go into the blocks and pass through I. So whichever one, whichever block we are working with, correct? And I'm just going to do class list, remove block. So to visually remove it, and I'm just going to remove it from the array. So I'm going to go into the array, I'm going to use splice, and I'm going to go wherever we are, +1, so that it just removes that block. Wonderful. So if one is removed, we're going to get the score and add one to it. I'm also going to change direction, but we're going to write a function for that. And once we've added the score +1, I can get the score display in a HTML and just update the score. So I'm just re-rendering the score essentially. So this is looking good. However, we also want to kind of figure out if we've removed all the blocks, right? So we're removing a block if we've hit it. However, if suddenly the block's length equals 0, I'm just going to do it like that in case that is a string, because this will not care if it's a string or a number. I'm going to get this score display in a HTML, and I'm just going to override it with you win. Okay, and I'm going to stop the game from playing. So I'm going to clear timer ID. And then I'm also going to remove the event listener. So remove event listener, key down, move user. Wonderful. So that's all that happens when we're checking for block collisions. And now, so 1, 2, 3, we're still in the function. So here, I'm going to check for wall hits as well. So we've just checked for block hits. Now we're going to check for what happens when we hit a wall. If ball current position, x-axis, is larger or equal to the board width minus the ball diameter, or, so this time it's an or, the ball current position x-axis is smaller than or equal to 0, or, so again, we're just checking all of the positions. This should be a minus. Ball current position y-axis is larger and equal to the board height minus the board diameter, and that's all we're going to check for. So if these three things are true, we're going to change direction. So again, we're going to write this change direction function soon. We have one more thing to check for, so check for user collisions if, it's going to maybe just make that a little bit more readable, put it on the same line. If ball current position 0 is larger than current position 0, and so if that's true, and the ball current position x-axis is smaller than current position x-axis of our user plus the block width, and this time we're going to do ball current position y-axis is larger than current position y-axis plus ball current position y-axis smaller than current position y-axis plus block height. Okay, so I know that's a lot to read. I'm just going to maybe put that on a new block, even though that is all wrapped in a parenthesis. Then, again, we should change direction. And finally, we're just going to check for a game over again in this function, because the game over happens on a collision. If ball current position y-axis is smaller than or equal to 0, then we clear the interval, because we're just checking the y-axis to see if the ball essentially goes out. Clear interval timer ID. Right, we want to check if it goes out here. That's the only way the game can be over, because it can hit here, it can hit here, it can hit here. If it goes past here, the game is over. We clear the timer ID, we get the score display in our HTML, and we go, you lose. Okay, and then we get the document and we remove the key down event listener and we stop the user from moving. Okay, wonderful. So now with one last thing, we're just going to change the direction, right? So let's go ahead and do it. Function change direction. And this time we're just going to be using the X direction and the Y direction. If X direction equals 2 and Y direction equals 2, we know that we're going a certain way, right? We know that we're going this way as we're adding 2 to the X and Y axis. I'm going to make it the Y direction change. So I'm going to make the Y direction be -2. Okay, and then I'm going to return out of this. So let's do the same. Let's do this 4 times, just changing some of these around. This time, if the Y direction is -2, I'm going to change the X direction to be -2. And this time, if the X direction is -2 and Y direction is -2, then I'm going to change the Y direction to be 2. And finally, if the X direction is -2 and the Y direction is 2, I'm going to change the X direction to be 2. Okay, great. So that is my whole change direction function. I'm just going to uncomment that out here and here and here. And let's give this game a go. So now, of course, you can change the speed at which you play this game, but I'm really happy with this. Amazing. I think this is looking so good. We're also adding to the score, okay? Of course, we need to remove all the blocks in order to win. So let's see if that happens. You can add, much more functionality to this. Like I said, this is a very basic game that will allow you to build the 2D Breakout game. Okay, so here we go. Thanks so much for watching this. I really hope that you enjoyed coding along with me. I've absolutely loved making this game. I would love to see how you take this game, take it to the next level, make it your own, because of course, as you know, it is yours. And yes, please do share your finished products.